Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, you will drift slowly into the distant past, to a cold and windswept world of long winters, restless seas, and quiet wooden villages scattered across the rugged lands of the north. You are no longer in the modern world. Instead, you wake in Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. The air is cold against your skin, and the smell of wood smoke drifts quietly through the morning air. It is the early Viking age. The year is somewhere around 750. You live in a small village near a fjord, where steep cliffs rise from dark water that stretches endlessly toward distant lands no one in your village has ever seen. Your home is a longhouse. It is built from thick wooden beams, with a roof made of grass and straw that keeps the warmth inside during harsh northern winters. Inside, the room is dim and warm. A fire burns slowly in the center of the house, sending thin trails of smoke toward a hole in the roof. The fire crackles quietly as the early morning light begins to slip through the doorway. You lie beneath thick wool blankets, listening to the sounds of the longhouse waking up. Someone nearby shifts in their sleep. A wooden floor creaks softly. Outside, you hear the distant cry of seabirds circling above the cold water. The Vikings are not yet the feared warriors that history will remember. For now, your people are farmers, fishers, traders, families trying to survive in a land where the soil is thin and winters are long. The north is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. Farming here is difficult. The growing season is short. Storms arrive without warning, and sometimes, when the harvest fails, entire villages struggle to survive the winter. But the people of the north are resilient. They adapt, they endure, they learn to work with the sea. Because the sea offers something the land does not: opportunity. As the morning grows brighter, you rise slowly from the warmth of the blankets. The air inside the longhouse is cool now that the fire has burned low overnight. You pull on thick wool clothing. Outside, the fjord stretches before you like a mirror of dark steel. Mist floats gently above the water. A few fishing boats rock quietly near the shore. The village is small. Perhaps 30 people live here. Families share work and food. Everyone depends on everyone else. Children chase each other between the houses. Dogs bark lazily. Women grind grain into flour using heavy stone tools. Men repair nets and sharpen tools. Life here moves slowly, but the world beyond your village is changing. Across Europe, kingdoms rise and fall. Empires grow powerful, and far to the south, wealthy monasteries store gold, silver, and books inside quiet stone walls. Your village does not know this yet, but soon, the people of the north will discover those places. And everything will change. For generations, your people have built boats. Simple wooden boats at first. Small vessels used for fishing along the coast. But over time, something remarkable begins to happen. Shipbuilders experiment. They carve longer planks. They design stronger hulls. They learn how to bend wood using heat and steam. And slowly, almost by accident, they create one of the most advanced ships the world has ever seen. The Viking longship. It is fast, flexible, and perfectly designed for the dangerous northern seas. Unlike other ships of the time, a longship can sail across open oceans. But it can also glide silently through shallow rivers. This ability will soon give the Vikings an advantage no one else expects. At first, the ships are used for trade. Merchants travel across the Baltic Sea. They exchange furs, amber, iron, and tools with distant communities. Slowly, Viking traders learn about lands far beyond Scandinavia. They hear stories of wealthy towns, rich monasteries, and kingdoms filled with silver. These stories spread from village to. As the Viking world expanded across seas and rivers, the lands of Scandinavia themselves were also changing. The villages along the fjords grew larger, and trade with distant regions became more common. Ships no longer returned carrying only silver from raids. Many now brought back goods from markets far away. Traders traveled east along long river routes that stretched through what is now Russia and Ukraine. Viking merchants sailed into wide rivers and then pulled their ships across land when the water routes ended. They carried furs, amber, iron tools, and slaves taken during raids. In distant markets they traded these goods for silver coins, silk cloth, spices, and jewelry from the Byzantine Empire and lands even farther away. One of the greatest cities these travelers reached was Constantinople. The Vikings called it Miklagard, meaning the great city. To men who had grown up in small northern villages, Constantinople must have looked almost unbelievable. Its massive walls stretched for miles, protecting golden churches and crowded markets filled with people from many cultures. Some Vikings became so respected for their fighting skill that the Byzantine emperors hired them as personal guards. This group became known as the Varangian Guard. Tall warriors from the north stood watch inside the emperor's palace, carrying large axes and wearing armor that gleamed in the sunlight. While some Vikings traveled east and others crossed the Atlantic, life at home continued changing slowly. Powerful leaders in Scandinavia began uniting smaller regions under single rulers. Instead of many tiny local chiefs, larger kingdoms started to form. In Norway, a king named Harald Fairhair became famous for bringing many rival clans under his control. According to later stories, Harald had once promised not to cut or comb his hair until he ruled all of Norway. After years of battles he finally succeeded, and his long uncut hair was trimmed at last. Whether the story is completely true or not, it reflects the growing power of kings in the north. Denmark and Sweden were also becoming more organized under strong rulers. As these kingdoms grew stronger, Viking activities slowly changed. Raids still happened, but many leaders began focusing more on controlling land and trade routes. Another powerful change began spreading across Scandinavia during this time. Christian missionaries traveled north from Europe, bringing a new religion with them. For centuries the Vikings had followed the Old Norse gods. They told stories of Odin, the wise god who sought knowledge above all else. They believed Thor, the thunder god, protected them with his mighty hammer. They spoke of Loki, the trickster whose clever schemes often caused trouble. These myths were deeply connected to Viking culture. Warriors believed they might enter Valhalla after death, a great hall where brave fighters prepared for the final battle of the gods known as Ragnarok. But Christianity brought different ideas. Missionaries spoke of one God instead of many. They built churches and encouraged rulers to adopt the new faith. At first many Vikings resisted these teachings. Their traditions had guided them for generations. Yet some kings began accepting Christianity for practical reasons. Converting to the new religion made it easier to form alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms in Europe. Trade also became easier when merchants shared similar beliefs and customs. Gradually churches appeared in Scandinavian towns. Wooden crosses replaced old symbols of the Norse gods in some places. People were baptized into the new faith. The transition did not happen all at once. For many years old beliefs and new ones existed side by side. Some families prayed to both Thor and the Christian God, unsure which power truly guided the world. But over time Christianity became the dominant religion throughout. As the years passed, the tales of those voyages became woven into songs and poems. Skalds, poets of the north, sang of waves that carried longships far beyond known lands, of battles fought on distant shores, and of families waiting at home with hope in their hearts. The rhythm of these stories echoed the rise and fall of the sea itself, flowing gently and then surging with dramatic intensity, capturing both the calm and the storm. Even in modern towns along the fjords, people still felt a quiet connection to these ancestors. Children played by the water's edge, stacking stones and imagining they were building fortresses. Elders told stories of courage, cunning, and the resilience required to survive in lands where winter was long and unforgiving. Every word they spoke carried a weight of history, a reminder of the generations who had once relied on the same sea for life and adventure. The natural world remained both a guide and a challenge. Birds traced the currents above the waves, following the migration paths their ancestors might have seen. The wind whispered through pine forests, bending trees that had stood for centuries. Seasons continued their endless cycle: spring's thaw, summer's warmth, autumn's gold, and winter's icy stillness. Through these rhythms, life moved on. Farmers harvested grain and tended livestock. Fishermen returned with their catches, greeting the shore with lanterns as darkness fell. Villages maintained a quiet harmony with nature, respecting its power and its generosity. The same landscapes that had shaped Viking lives continued to shape the lives of those who came after. And yet, curiosity never faded. Modern explorers, scientists, and sailors studied these northern waters, retracing routes that had once been charted only by instinct and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. They measured tides, tracked winds, and mapped coastlines with precision unimaginable to Viking eyes. But beneath all their technology, the essence of exploration remained the same: the desire to understand what lay beyond the horizon, to push forward even when the path was uncertain. Even in the quietest moments, the sea seemed to speak. Its lapping waves reminded observers of countless journeys, countless stories of courage, and countless lives lived in harmony with its unpredictable nature. And in this gentle rhythm, there was a subtle reminder: while history records names and dates, the true legacy of the Vikings lay in their spirit, the spirit that moved people to explore, to endure, and to dream. Every night, as the fjord waters reflected the pale light of the moon, the past seemed to rise again. Longships imagined in the mind's eye glided silently across the waves, carrying crews whose stories still waited to be remembered. And as the world slept, the rhythm of the Vikings' journeys, their triumphs and trials, continued to echo, softly, steadily, endlessly, inviting anyone who listened closely to drift into the rise and fall of their enduring tale. Dawn approached slowly, brushing the horizon with pale gold. Mist clung to the fjords, drifting lazily across the water, curling around the rocks like ghostly fingers. The village still slept, though faint smoke from chimneys hinted that some had begun early preparations. Fishermen moved quietly toward the longships, carrying nets, hooks, and small baskets of bait. Their footsteps left temporary impressions on the frozen earth, soon to vanish under the shifting mist. The sea, calm yet alive, whispered softly against the hulls. The longships, resting as if in deep meditation, were prepared to carry men to distant shores, yet for now, they waited in patient stillness. Seagulls wheeled overhead, occasionally dipping to snatch a fish from the shallow water. The sound of their wings and cries mingled with the gentle lapping of waves, creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to stretch time itself. Beyond the shore, the forest stirred. Deer emerged cautiously from shadowed thickets, ears flicking toward unseen dangers. Foxes padded silently across snow-laden paths, their tails brushing the ground like soft brushes of fur. Birds began their morning songs, tentative and melodic, creating a soundtrack for a land that had seen centuries of life and death, exploration, and survival. The world woke not abruptly but gradually, each sound and movement layered upon another, forming an orchestra of subtle life. In the village, the elders gathered near the central fire pit. They spoke softly, their words deliberate, recounting tales of raids long past, lands explored, and seas crossed. These were not stories of glory alone, but of learning, how weather could destroy ships, how patience and observation could save lives, how courage without wisdom could lead to ruin. Young apprentices listened intently, their eyes reflecting the firelight and the lessons embedded within each word. Meanwhile, children ran along the frozen paths, their laughter cautious, blending with the natural symphony around them. They practiced skills of survival, mimicking adults in controlled ways, throwing small spears, identifying tracks, reading the clouds, observing the wind. Each action was a lesson in rhythm, in observation, in understanding the rise and fall of both nature and human endeavors. The village, though small and isolated, was a living classroom. Every task, every movement, every moment of reflection carried the imprint of the ancestors and the land itself. A blacksmith struck metal rhythmically in a distant hut. Sparks leapt into the cold air, falling like stars onto the frozen ground. The sound was both harsh and melodic, a cadence that spoke of creation, labor, and necessity. Tools were shaped, weapons tempered, and implements repaired. The blacksmith's movements were precise, each strike measured, each pause deliberate. The music of the hammer against metal resonated with the rhythm of the village, syncing with the breathing of the forest and the distant murmur of the sea. On the cliffs above, a scout scanned the horizon. Binoculars were not needed. Keen eyes, trained over years, could detect subtle movements across the fjord. A small fishing boat, far from the village, drifted with the tide, its lone occupant bending over nets. A plume of smoke rose faintly in the distance from a mountain ridge, likely a fire for warmth or signaling. The scout recorded each observation, understanding the importance of knowledge, awareness, and timing. Survival depended not on haste but on perception, patience, and the ability to act when the moment was right. As the sun rose higher, the village came fully alive. Fishermen returned with baskets of fish glistening in the morning light. Smoke rose more steadily from chimneys as families began preparing meals. Children gathered near elders, eager for more stories. Each tale carried dual meaning, the immediate plot and the. Eric the Red was known among the Vikings for his fierce temper and strong will. He had been born in Norway but spent much of his life in Iceland after his family left their homeland during a time of conflict. Iceland offered freedom and new land, but life there was not always peaceful. Disputes between neighbors sometimes turned into violent feuds. During one of these conflicts, Eric became involved in a series of fights that eventually led to the deaths of several men. According to the laws of Iceland, this kind of violence could lead to exile. Eric was declared an outlaw and forced to leave the island for several years. For many people, exile would have meant the end of their story. But for a Viking sailor, exile sometimes meant opportunity. Eric remembered hearing stories from earlier sailors who had glimpsed distant land far to the west of Iceland. Some claimed they had seen mountains rising beyond the horizon during clear weather. Others believed it might have been nothing more than clouds or mist playing tricks on their eyes. Eric decided to find out the truth. He gathered a small crew and prepared a ship for a dangerous journey into waters few had ever attempted to cross. The Atlantic Ocean west of Iceland was cold and unpredictable. Storms could appear without warning, and thick fog could hide the sun and stars for days. Still, Eric and his crew pushed forward. Their longship rose and fell with the heavy waves as they sailed westward. The wind howled across the sail at times, forcing the crew to lower it and rely on rowing to maintain control. The cold air bit into their faces, and icy spray coated the deck. Days passed with nothing but gray ocean stretching in every direction. Then, one morning, the lookout spotted something on the horizon. At first it appeared as a faint shadow rising above the water. As the ship drew closer, the shape became clearer. Mountains stood in the distance, their peaks covered with snow and ice. Eric and his crew had discovered Greenland. Despite its icy name, parts of Greenland contained green valleys during the short summer months. Rivers flowed down from glaciers, and grassy land offered places where animals could graze. Eric spent several seasons exploring the coastline. He searched for locations where farms might survive the harsh climate. Eventually he found a few sheltered fjords that seemed suitable for settlement. When his period of exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland with exciting news. He spoke about the new land he had found to the west. He described valleys where grass grew and rivers flowed with fresh water. To make the place sound even more appealing, he gave it a welcoming name, Greenland. Eric believed people would be more willing to move there if the land sounded inviting. His plan worked. Soon several ships filled with settlers prepared to leave Iceland. Families packed animals, farming tools, and supplies for the long journey. The voyage to Greenland was difficult, and not every ship survived the crossing. But many settlers eventually reached the fjords Eric had explored. They built farms along the narrow coastal valleys where grass could grow during summer. Cattle, sheep, and goats were raised there. Houses made of wood and turf protected the settlers from the fierce winter winds. The Greenland settlements remained small and isolated, but they became an important part of the Viking world. Ships traveled between Iceland and Greenland carrying supplies, tools, and news from other lands. Among the children growing up in Greenland was Eric's son, Leif Erikson. Leif inherited his father's curiosity about the unknown world beyond the sea. As he grew older he became an experienced sailor, traveling frequently between Greenland and Norway. During one of these journeys he heard a story that captured his imagination. A sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson had once been blown far off. Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, you will drift slowly into the distant past, to a cold and windswept world of long winters, restless seas, and quiet wooden villages scattered across the rugged lands of the north. You are no longer in the modern world. Instead, you wake in Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago. The air is cold against your skin, and the smell of wood smoke drifts quietly through the morning air. It is the early Viking age. The year is somewhere around 750. You live in a small village near a fjord, where steep cliffs rise from dark water that stretches endlessly toward distant lands no one in your village has ever seen. Your home is a longhouse. It is built from thick wooden beams, with a roof made of grass and straw that keeps the warmth inside during harsh northern winters. Inside, the room is dim and warm. A fire burns slowly in the center of the house, sending thin trails of smoke toward a hole in the roof. The fire crackles quietly as the early morning light begins to slip through the doorway. You lie beneath thick wool blankets, listening to the sounds of the longhouse waking up. Someone nearby shifts in their sleep. A wooden floor creaks softly. Outside, you hear the distant cry of seabirds circling above the cold water. The Vikings are not yet the feared warriors that history will remember. For now, your people are farmers, fishers, traders, families trying to survive in a land where the soil is thin and winters are long. The north is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. Farming here is difficult. The growing season is short. Storms arrive without warning, and sometimes, when the harvest fails, entire villages struggle to survive the winter. But the people of the north are resilient. They adapt, they endure, they learn to work with the sea. Because the sea offers something the land does not: opportunity. As the morning grows brighter, you rise slowly from the warmth of the blankets. The air inside the longhouse is cool now that the fire has burned low overnight. You pull on thick wool clothing. Outside, the fjord stretches before you like a mirror of dark steel. Mist floats gently above the water. A few fishing boats rock quietly near the shore. The village is small. Perhaps 30 people live here. Families share work and food. Everyone depends on everyone else. Children chase each other between the houses. Dogs bark lazily. Women grind grain into flour using heavy stone tools. Men repair nets and sharpen tools. Life here moves slowly, but the world beyond your village is changing. Across Europe, kingdoms rise and fall. Empires grow powerful, and far to the south, wealthy monasteries store gold, silver, and books inside quiet stone walls. Your village does not know this yet, but soon, the people of the north will discover those places. And everything will change. For generations, your people have built boats. Simple wooden boats at first. Small vessels used for fishing along the coast. But over time, something remarkable begins to happen. Shipbuilders experiment. They carve longer planks. They design stronger hulls. They learn how to bend wood using heat and steam. And slowly, almost by accident, they create one of the most advanced ships the world has ever seen. The Viking longship. It is fast, flexible, and perfectly designed for the dangerous northern seas. Unlike other ships of the time, a longship can sail across open oceans. But it can also glide silently through shallow rivers. This ability will soon give the Vikings an advantage no one else expects. At first, the ships are used for trade. Merchants travel across the Baltic Sea. They exchange furs, amber, iron, and tools with distant communities. Slowly, Viking traders learn about lands far beyond Scandinavia. They hear stories of wealthy towns, rich monasteries, and kingdoms filled with silver. These stories spread from village to good evening. You remain in the north, in the same quiet village beside the fjord where the story began. The morning after the longship first touched the wheel bends slightly instead of breaking. This simple but clever design allows it to survive storms that would destroy other ships. The knowledge behind this construction has been passed quietly from builder to builder for generations, improved a little more each time a new ship is created. Today the crew prepares for a journey that will take them farther than most people in the village have ever traveled. The sail is brought out from a nearby shed. It is made from thick woven wool, heavy but strong enough to catch the powerful northern winds. When raised on the mast, it will transform the longship from a rowing vessel into a swift sailing craft capable of crossing wide stretches of sea. As the crew lifts the mast into place, the sound of wood sliding against wood echoes softly across the shoreline. Ropes are tied carefully, knots are pulled tight. Every detail matters because once the ship leaves the safety of the fjord, the open sea offers little forgiveness for mistakes. You stand near the edge of the water watching as the final preparations unfold. The ship now carries supplies for many days. Barrels of water and dried fish sit secured beneath wooden benches where the rowers will sit. Bundles of wool blankets and spare clothing are tucked into corners of the ship. A small chest containing tools and weapons rests near the stern. The men who will sail on this journey move with quiet focus. Some sharpen their axes using smooth stones. Others check the oars that will help guide the ship through narrow waters and calm winds. These men are not yet the legendary warriors that later generations will imagine. For now they are simply villagers preparing for a voyage fueled by curiosity, ambition, and the hope of returning with stories or wealth. As the sun climbs higher into the sky, the wind begins to stir across the surface of the fjord. Small ripples form on the water. The longship shifts gently against its moorings. The moment for departure approaches. A final meal is shared among the crew and their families. Bread made from coarse grain is passed around along with smoked fish and a few cups of ale. Conversations remain quiet but hopeful. Everyone understands that travel by sea carries risk, but the people of this land have always lived with risk. Harsh winters, poor harvests, and sudden storms have taught them that survival often depends on courage. Soon the crew climbs aboard the longship. The ropes tying it to shore are loosened. With a gentle push from several hands, the vessel begins to slide away from the sand. The water embraces the hull once more and the ship floats freely. Rowers take their seats along both sides. Long oars dip into the cold water at the same moment. With steady strokes they guide the ship away from the shore. The sound of the oars cutting through the fjord becomes the only noise for a few moments. The ship moves slowly at first. Then the rhythm of rowing grows stronger. The distance between the longship and the village begins to widen. People on the shore watch quietly as the vessel glides farther into the fjord. Once the ship reaches deeper water, the sail is raised. The heavy wool cloth unfolds and climbs the mast as ropes are pulled tight. The wind catches the sail almost immediately. The longship leans slightly as the force of the wind pushes against it. The rowers lift their oars from the water. Now the ship moves forward powered by the steady northern breeze. From the shore it appears smaller with every passing moment. Soon it becomes little more than a dark shape against the shining water. Eventually it disappears completely as it rounds the bend of the fjord and sails out toward the open sea. For the people left behind, the village slowly returns too. Night deepened further over the fjords. The auroras shimmered like slow-moving rivers of light, casting green, violet, and pale blue hues across ice-laden cliffs. The reflection in the water made the fjord seem infinite, a mirror stretching endlessly, blurring the line between sky and earth. Waves whispered against the rocks in low, patient rhythms, a lullaby older than any human memory. In the village, fires burned low in hearths, the scent of cooked fish and bread lingering faintly. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle aroma of pine and wet earth. Shadows danced along walls, moving with the flickering flames, as if the spirits of ancestors walked silently among the villagers. A soft wind moved through open doorways, carrying warmth into the cold night and guiding the last footsteps of those finishing evening chores. Elders gathered near a small fire pit outside, cloaked against the chill. Their voices, quiet but deliberate, began recounting stories of the seas, the great rivers and oceans where longships had ventured, facing storms that could swallow a vessel whole. Tales of storms were balanced with stories of navigation, the use of stars, the color of clouds, the behavior of birds, and the subtle smells of sea and land. Each tale layered into a rhythm, teaching young listeners patience, awareness, and respect for forces larger than themselves. In the forest beyond the village, owls began their night watch. Their wings moved silently through the dark, eyes glinting with reflection. Small creatures scurried, aware of their presence but confident in their camouflage and speed. Wolves moved with low, deliberate steps, their senses tuned to every rustle and scent. Even as night deepened, life followed its rhythm, the rise and fall of pursuit, of waiting, of observation. Every movement carried meaning, every pause was measured, every sound was a signal. The fjord, now almost completely dark, held a different kind of life. Fish swam near the surface, drawn by moonlight reflected off the water. The longships that had ventured earlier returned slowly, oars cutting silently, crews attuned to the subtle movements of the waves. A distant gull cried, momentary and solitary, its sound swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the fjord. The water carried every motion, amplifying some, softening others, creating a continuous, breathing rhythm. Within the village, children listened to the wind and stories alike. They sat close to fires, their hands near warmth, eyes wide with curiosity. They learned not just about Vikings and battles, but about patience, timing, and observation. One elder described how a single misjudgment in the fjord could cost life, how reading the rhythm of the waves could mean survival. Another told how even the slowest of animals in the forest taught lessons of caution and timing. Every tale, every story, carried multiple layers, the literal and the subliminal, the immediate and the eternal. By midnight, the village was quiet. Fires were low, smoke curling lazily into the sky, carrying scent that mixed with pine and frost. The longships rested again at the fjord's edge, reflecting faint light in gentle ripples. The village itself seemed to breathe, moving with the rhythm of night, sleep, vigilance, preparation. Even the stars seemed to pulse slowly, almost imperceptibly, guiding those awake and comforting those asleep. Beyond, in distant mountains, a storm whispered across peaks. Snow shifted, moved, and fell in delicate cascades, echoing silently through valleys. Streams swelled slightly under the melting snow, following natural channels carved over centuries. The storm was not destructive yet, merely a reminder of nature's presence, an invisible rhythm guiding the lives below. Those who understood it could prepare, could adapt, could respect the ebb and flow without resisting it. As hours passed, the village, over the centuries the northern lands continued to change, but the rhythm of life near the sea remained steady and familiar. The fjords still shaped the coastline the same way they had thousands of years before. Cold water stretched between steep mountains, reflecting clouds that drifted slowly across the northern sky. Boats still moved across those waters every day. They were smaller now and built for fishing and trade rather than exploration. Yet the people guiding them carried the same quiet understanding of the sea that their ancestors once relied on during long voyages. Morning in a coastal village often began before sunrise. Fishermen woke while the sky was still dark and pushed their boats into the cold water. Lanterns glowed faintly along the shoreline as nets were prepared and ropes were coiled carefully. The sea could be generous or harsh, just as it had been during the Viking Age. Some days the boats returned filled with fish. On other days the water remained quiet and empty. But patience had always been part of life in the north. Farmers worked narrow strips of land between mountains and sea. Sheep moved slowly across grassy hills. Smoke rose from chimneys as families gathered inside wooden houses during cold evenings. The world had grown larger since the days when Vikings first sailed beyond the horizon. Maps now showed distant continents and oceans. Ships built from iron crossed the seas with powerful engines instead of sails. Yet the story of the Vikings remained an important part of northern identity. In Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, museums carefully preserved artifacts from that earlier time. Visitors could stand beside ancient longships and study the way their curved wooden hulls were built. The craftsmanship still amazed historians and engineers alike. Those ships had been constructed without modern tools or machines. Everything was shaped by hand using axes, knives, and careful skill passed down through generations. The builders understood something essential about the sea. A ship needed to be strong enough to survive storms but flexible enough to move with the waves instead of fighting them. That balance allowed Viking ships to travel across oceans that many people of their time believed were impossible to cross. The stories told in the Icelandic sagas continued to fascinate readers as well. Within those pages were descriptions of journeys through ice-filled seas, feuds between powerful families, and the determination required to build a new life in harsh lands. Some sagas described explorers who sailed west to lands where forests stretched endlessly. Others told about traders who followed rivers deep into the lands of powerful empires. Through these stories the memory of the Viking Age survived. Archaeologists continued uncovering new clues about that distant era. Runestones carved with ancient symbols revealed the names of travelers who had journeyed far from home. Buried treasures of silver coins showed how widely Viking trade networks had once spread. Each discovery added another small piece to the puzzle of how these northern sailors had shaped the medieval world. Perhaps the most fascinating part of the Viking story is how ordinary many of those people probably were. Most Vikings were not legendary warriors or famous explorers. They were farmers, craftsmen, traders, and families simply trying to survive in a challenging environment. Yet when opportunity appeared beyond the horizon, they had the courage to follow it. That courage carried them across thousands of miles of ocean and river. It connected distant cultures and opened trade routes that would influence history for centuries. And even though their age of exploration eventually came to an end, the spirit of curiosity that guided them never truly disappeared. Humans continued exploring new frontiers long after the Viking longships were gone. The centuries that followed did not erase the memory of the Vikings. Even as their raids ended and their kingdoms changed, the stories of their voyages continued to travel across generations. In the villages of Scandinavia, winter nights were long and dark. Families gathered inside warm longhouses while the wind howled outside. Fires crackled in the center of the room, sending sparks upward toward the wooden beams of the roof. During those quiet nights, storytellers spoke about the old days. They told of ships with dragon heads cutting through stormy seas. They spoke of warriors who sailed across unknown oceans guided only by the stars and the rising sun. They told stories about great leaders, brave explorers, and distant lands where forests stretched farther than anyone could walk in a single day. Some of these stories were true memories of real events. Others slowly grew into legends as each generation added new details. The tale of Ragnar Lothbrok became one of those legendary stories. In some versions he fought giant serpents and defeated powerful kings. In others his sons led armies that shook entire kingdoms. Whether every part of those stories happened exactly as told mattered less than the spirit behind them. The stories reminded people that their ancestors had once been fearless travelers who crossed oceans without knowing what waited beyond the horizon. In Iceland these traditions were written down centuries later in long texts called sagas. The sagas preserved the adventures of explorers, farmers, warriors, and families who struggled to survive in a harsh northern world. Through those writings modern historians were able to piece together much of what happened during the Viking Age. Archaeologists also began discovering physical evidence left behind by Viking travelers. Old ship graves were uncovered beneath the earth. Inside them lay beautifully crafted longships buried with powerful leaders. Tools, weapons, jewelry, and everyday objects revealed how advanced Viking craftsmanship had been. One of the most remarkable discoveries was the Oseberg ship found in Norway. The vessel had been buried more than 1,000 years earlier. When it was carefully uncovered, archaeologists realized it was one of the most elegant ships ever built by Viking shipbuilders. Its curved wooden hull and intricate carvings showed the skill and artistry of the people who created it. Other discoveries appeared across Europe. Viking coins were found in England and Ireland. Scandinavian jewelry appeared in markets far from the north. Tools and weapons revealed how Viking metalworkers shaped iron into strong blades and useful equipment. Perhaps the most surprising discovery came in North America. For centuries historians debated whether the stories about Vinland were real or simply myths from the Icelandic sagas. Then in the 1960s archaeologists discovered the remains of a Viking settlement at a place now called L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The remains included turf houses, ironworking tools, and objects clearly linked to Viking culture. This discovery confirmed that Norse explorers had indeed reached North America around the year 1000. The settlement there was small and short-lived, but it proved that Viking sailors had crossed the Atlantic centuries before later explorers. Today the legacy of the Vikings can still be seen in many parts of the world. Cities like Dublin, York, and Kiev all grew partly from settlements created during the Viking Age. Words from the Old Norse language remain in English and other European languages. Even the names of certain days of the week come from Norse gods. Thursday, for example, comes from Thor's Day. Modern ships are far more advanced than the wooden longships of the past, yet many naval designers still admire the Viking ships for their clever construction and balance of strength and speed. The night deepened, and the northern lights began their slow dance across the sky, green and violet ribbons twisting above the fjords. In the villages below, fires crackled in hearths, casting warm glows on the timber walls, while families settled into evening routines that had changed little over centuries. The smell of smoked fish and freshly baked bread mingled with the crisp air, a sensory reminder of survival and comfort in a land both beautiful and harsh. Out at sea, the longships, though now silent and resting, seemed almost alive under the moonlight. Their dragon-headed prows cast shadows on the water, echoes of journeys taken long ago when warriors and traders braved storms and pirates to discover new lands. The sound of waves against the shore was steady, like a heartbeat, a reminder that life continued in rhythm with the tides, each rise and fall marking another chapter in the story of this rugged land. In the hills, lone figures walked carefully along narrow paths, carrying lanterns to illuminate the rocks and roots beneath their feet. They moved with purpose, as if following invisible maps left by ancestors, gathering herbs, checking traps, or simply walking to feel the pulse of the earth beneath them. The wind carried scents of pine, salt, and rain-soaked soil, blending past and present in a tapestry of sound and smell that was uniquely Scandinavian, uniquely Viking. Even the small creatures contributed to the world's quiet symphony. Owls hooted softly from treetops, foxes padded through underbrush, and the distant howl of a wolf added depth to the night. The balance of predator and prey, of night and day, of land and sea, was a rhythm that humans had learned to respect, shaping their own lives around the cycles of nature rather than against them. Back in the villages, stories continued to flow. Elders recounted legends of great voyages, lost cities, and battles fought under stormy skies. Children listened with wide eyes, imagining the cold spray of the sea on their faces, the roar of warriors' voices across a battlefield, and the thrill of stepping into the unknown. These stories, repeated night after night, kept the memory of ancestors alive, ensuring that the bravery, curiosity, and wisdom of the past were never forgotten. The fjords themselves seemed to respond. Water lapped gently against cliffs, echoing softly through narrow channels, creating harmonies that felt almost musical. Mist rose from the surface, curling around rocks and islands, forming shapes that sparked imagination, perhaps a longship in full sail, perhaps the outline of a mythical creature. Every ripple and reflection was a meditation, a reminder that life was not only about the actions of humans but also about observing, listening, and becoming one with the world around them. The returning sailors gather near the fire inside the longhouse as night slowly settles over the fjord. Their voices are calm but filled with quiet excitement. People lean closer to listen as the crew begins describing what they saw across the sea. The journey west had taken several days. At first there was nothing but open water and shifting gray skies. The longship moved steadily over rolling waves, sometimes guided by the wind and sometimes pushed forward by the steady rhythm of rowing. Nights were spent drifting beneath wide northern stars, with the crew wrapped in thick cloaks as the cold wind moved across the sea. Eventually the shape of land appeared on the horizon. At first it was only a dark line where the sea met the sky. But as the ship drew closer the coastline became clear. Tall cliffs rose above the water and green fields stretched beyond them. The sailors had reached the shores of England. They followed the coast carefully, watching for safe places to land. Smoke from distant villages drifted into the sky. Small farms dotted the hills. Everything looked different from the rocky fjords of home, yet strangely inviting. One morning they spotted a quiet settlement near the water. A stone building stood there surrounded by smaller wooden structures. The crew had heard stories about places like this. Monasteries. Religious houses where monks lived in peace and spent their days praying, writing books, and tending gardens. But monasteries also held wealth. Inside were silver crosses, gold decorations, and valuable objects given by kings and nobles over many years. And unlike castles or cities, monasteries were rarely defended by soldiers. The longship slipped quietly toward the shore. The crew jumped into the shallow water and pulled the ship onto the beach. Axes hung at their sides, though most of them had never used their weapons in battle before. Their hearts beat faster as they approached the stone building. The monks inside had no warning. To them the morning had begun like any other. Bells had rung at sunrise. Prayers had been spoken. Work had begun in the gardens and workshops. Then strangers appeared. Tall men with unfamiliar clothing and long hair moved across the fields toward the monastery walls. Within moments the peaceful routine of the place was broken by confusion and fear. The Vikings pushed open the wooden doors and entered. They moved quickly, taking silver cups, decorated books, and small pieces of gold from the rooms inside. Some monks fled into nearby fields while others hid inside dark corners of the building. The entire raid lasted less than an hour. When it was over, the crew carried their discoveries back to the ship. The treasure was not enormous, but it was more wealth than many of them had ever seen before. They pushed the longship back into the water and sailed away before nearby villages could respond. As the wind filled the sail, the coastline of England slowly faded behind them. The voyage home felt very different from the journey outward. Now the ship carried proof that these distant lands held opportunity. Silver glinted in the sunlight as the crew examined their prizes. Some objects would be melted down. Others would be traded. A few might even become family treasures passed down through generations. When the longship finally returned to the fjord weeks later, the news spread quickly. People gathered around the sailors as they told their story again and again. Each telling added small details. The stone monastery, the quiet monks, the silver hidden inside wooden chests. Listeners imagined the distant coast across the sea. They imagined the wealth waiting there. Soon other villages heard the same stories. Shipbuilders began constructing more longships. Young men volunteered eagerly for future voyages. Without fully realizing it, the people of Scandinavia had taken the first steps into what? The stories of the first voyages spread slowly across the fjords and valleys of Scandinavia. At first they sounded almost unbelievable. A few sailors had crossed the sea, returned with silver, and spoken of distant lands where monasteries stood unguarded along quiet coasts. But as more ships began returning with similar tales, those stories started to feel real. New longships appeared along the shorelines each summer. Villages that once built only fishing boats now spent months shaping long curved hulls designed for travel across open water. Shipbuilders cut tall oak trees from nearby forests, splitting the wood carefully into long planks. Iron nails were hammered into place one by one. Slowly the skeleton of each vessel came together. These ships were unlike anything the world had seen before. They were light, fast, and able to sail both the deep ocean and shallow rivers. Their shallow draft allowed them to glide into beaches where larger ships could never land. Their sails caught even modest winds, and when the wind disappeared, the rowers could drive the ship forward with steady strength. By the end of the 8th century, longships began appearing far more often along the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Some came to trade peacefully. Others came quickly and without warning. Villages that once looked calmly toward the sea now watched the horizon with caution. Among the growing number of Viking leaders, stories began to circulate about a particular warrior whose ambition stretched far beyond simple raids. His name, according to later legends, was Ragnar Lothbrok. It is difficult to know how much of Ragnar's story is history and how much is legend told around fires during long winters. But in the stories that survived, Ragnar was a curious and daring leader who believed the western seas held opportunities far greater than anyone had yet discovered. According to these tales, Ragnar began his life much like many other young men in Scandinavia. He grew up near the coast, learning to sail and fight from an early age. The sea fascinated him. He listened closely whenever returning sailors described distant lands across the water. Eventually he gathered a small crew and built a longship designed for speed. His goal was simple: travel farther than anyone else had before. The voyages attributed to Ragnar carried him repeatedly to the shores of England and France. Some stories claim he attacked wealthy monasteries along the coast, returning home with treasures that made his name famous across Scandinavia. Other stories suggest he traveled along large rivers deep into foreign kingdoms where powerful rulers controlled cities far larger than anything found in the north. Whether Ragnar truly accomplished all these things or whether later storytellers added new adventures to his legend is difficult to know. But the importance of the stories themselves cannot be ignored. They inspired many other Viking leaders to follow similar paths. Soon the Viking world entered a new phase. Instead of small groups arriving briefly along foreign shores, larger forces began organizing into powerful armies. These warriors did not intend to raid and leave quickly. They intended to stay. In the year 865, a large Viking force arrived in England. Later historians would call this army the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiding parties, this group came prepared for long campaigns. Hundreds, possibly thousands of warriors landed along the eastern coast. Their ships filled the rivers and estuaries. Their camps spread across the countryside. England at that time was not a single united kingdom. Instead, it consisted of several smaller kingdoms including Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. These kingdoms sometimes cooperated with one another, but often they competed for power. The Viking army took advantage of this division. They moved quickly from one region to. The sun rose higher, sending gold and amber across the fjord. The reflection in the water was dazzling, almost too bright to look at directly, yet soft enough to feel like a gentle caress. Longships floated silently, rocking lightly, the oars dipping in perfect synchrony. The men and women aboard moved with rhythm, adjusting sails and checking ropes, attuned to the subtle language of wind, water, and vessel. Every sound carried meaning: the creak of a mast, the slap of a wave, the distant cry of a gull. All of it formed a silent conversation between human, ship, and sea. In the village, the market began to stir. Stalls were set up, and merchants arranged fish, cloth, tools, and handcrafted goods. The air was rich with scents: fresh bread, smoked fish, pine, herbs, and the faint tang of saltwater. Villagers moved deliberately, negotiating quietly, their voices low, carrying calm authority. Children followed behind, absorbing not just the sights and sounds but the rhythm of life, the subtle interplay of work, trade, and observation. It was a dance older than the village itself. A storyteller gathered a small crowd near the central fire. He began a tale of a Viking who traveled far beyond known lands, describing icy seas where waves rose higher than mountains. His voice was low, steady, weaving a pattern that drew listeners into trance. The storyteller described the Vikings' interactions with strangers, the challenges of navigation, the careful reading of the skies, the sound of water against hull. Every pause, every emphasis, encouraged deep attention and subtly guided breathing, creating a sense of slow calm and immersion. In the forest, hunters returned from their morning journey, bringing small game and learning lessons about patience. The young followed, mimicking movements and observing reactions. A rabbit's quick dart into brush, a bird's sudden flight, the silent pause of a wolf on a ridge, all were studied carefully. Children learned that every creature followed a rhythm, a pattern, and that understanding these patterns allowed coexistence and survival. Even the harshest winters could be faced with preparation, patience, and respect for the land. As midday approached, the longships prepared for a voyage farther out. The crew synchronized every motion, understanding that a single misstep could create imbalance. Oars cut into water rhythmically, sails caught wind with precision, and every movement reinforced discipline and focus. Seagulls wheeled overhead, diving occasionally, their cries part of the symphony of sea and sky. Waves lapped against hulls in continuous cadence, each ripple a note in a natural melody that guided timing and movement. Back in the village, artisans continued their work. Blacksmiths hammered, sparks rising in golden arcs. Carpenters shaped wood for shields and longships. Weavers moved looms with deliberate care, patterns forming slowly, beautifully, and perfectly. Each action was measured, rhythmic, almost meditative. The day unfolded as a continuous lesson: observation, attention, repetition, and respect for tools, land, and life. The storyteller resumed in the late afternoon, speaking of distant lands filled with strange animals and people. His voice rose and fell like the waves on the fjord, carrying listeners through adventure, danger, and discovery. The young and old alike sat entranced, their attention deep, their breathing slow and even. The cadence of the story mirrored the natural rhythms of life: rise, fall, movement, stillness. Even the wind seemed to pause as if listening. By evening, the longships returned. Nets hung heavy with fish, sails dripping with saltwater, and the crews moved slowly toward the docks, muscles sore but hearts steady. The return journey mirrored the outward rhythm: careful observation, balance, and adaptation. The village greeted them with calm acknowledgement. The wind whispered through the tall pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the distant tang of salt from the fjords. Moonlight spilled over the landscape, illuminating the peaks and valleys in silvery tones, making the rocks and snow-capped cliffs glimmer like scattered jewels. Somewhere in the distance, the faint clatter of a blacksmith's hammer echoed, a lonely reminder of human presence in a land otherwise dominated by nature's grandeur. On the shores, the longships rested, their hulls gently rocking with the tides. Some had been stripped of paint, their wood weathered by storms and time, yet the dragon-headed prows still bore a fierce dignity. Seagulls circled above, their cries piercing the calm air, while the water reflected the flickering auroras in a dizzying display of green and violet. A lone figure walked along the beach, leaving footprints in the wet sand. Cloaked against the cold, he paused to touch the dragon prow of one ship, feeling the cold, rough wood beneath his fingers. He could almost hear the echoes of 1,000 voyages, the creak of oars, the shouts of men, the clash of swords, and the laughter of comrades after a successful raid or trade mission. In the village tucked behind the cliffs, smoke rose steadily from chimneys. Inside, the firelight danced across walls adorned with shields, tapestries, and carvings that told stories of gods, monsters, and heroes. Families gathered quietly, sharing meals of salted fish, root vegetables, and coarse bread. Their conversation was low, almost a hum, respecting the night and the rhythm of sleep. But even in their calm, the energy of the Vikings, curiosity, courage, and a deep connection to the land, was present in their gestures, in the way they carefully maintained tools and crafted objects, in the way elders shared lessons and warnings, in the way children listened with rapt attention. Farther into the forest, the quiet became deeper. Snow crunched under the feet of wandering animals: foxes, hares, and deer, all alert to every sound. The owls continued their distant, soft calls, and the occasional rustle of branches hinted at larger creatures moving stealthily. Wolves, though rarely seen, were never far. Their presence was felt in the tension of the air, in the way prey shifted nervously beneath the trees. Life here was a careful balance of predator and prey, a rhythm that mirrored the rise and fall of human fortunes, the ebb and flow of trade, war, and exploration. Nighttime rituals continued in the village, subtle and quiet, yet full of significance. Some children were guided to the streams to learn the patterns of water flow and fish movement, the lessons of survival passed down through generations. Others learned to identify tracks in the snow or recognize the call of distant animals. The elders told stories in hushed tones, weaving fact and myth, explaining the rise and fall of kingdoms, the long journeys across the seas, and the encounters with strange lands and peoples. Every story was a thread, connecting the present to the past, making the children part of a long chain of observation, courage, and resilience. The fjords, silent yet alive, reflected this rhythm. Water moved with a subtle cadence, tides rising and falling in sync with the lunar cycle, waves caressing the rocks in patterns that had existed for millennia. The wind brought scents from far away: distant forests, fresh rain, the saltiness of the ocean. On occasion, a longship's sail flapped gently in the breeze, a reminder of journeys taken and yet to come. Every element, the sky, the land, the water, the animals, participated in a quiet symphony, a natural rhythm that humans could join but never fully control. In the hills beyond, a solitary figure climbed slowly, carrying a small bundle of herbs, roots, and dried meat. The path was steep, winding between jagged rocks, but the years continued passing quietly across the northern lands. The great era of Viking voyages had faded, but the people of Scandinavia still lived close to the sea, just as their ancestors had done for centuries. Fishing boats now replaced most of the longships that once filled the fjords. Instead of preparing for raids or distant exploration, families focused on farming, trading, and building stable towns. Small coastal villages slowly grew into organized settlements with markets, churches, and stronger houses made from timber and stone. Yet the ocean never stopped shaping life in the north. Every morning fishermen pushed their boats into the cold water and rowed into the fjords, just as their ancestors had once done before setting sail for distant lands. Nets were cast into the sea. Seabirds circled overhead, watching for fish near the surface. Children growing up in these villages still heard stories about the great voyages of the past. Elders spoke about ships with dragon heads and warriors who crossed oceans guided only by stars and wind. Even though those days were gone, the pride remained. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the growing kingdoms became more connected with the rest of Europe. Trade ships traveled regularly between northern ports and cities in England, Germany, and the Baltic region. Merchants exchanged grain, timber, iron, and furs for cloth, tools, and silver coins. As trade increased, towns began to develop along important coastlines and rivers. Markets filled with people speaking different languages. Craftsmen built workshops where they shaped metal, carved wood, and created fine jewelry. Many of these towns had originally begun as Viking trading posts centuries earlier. Now they were becoming permanent parts of European civilization. In Iceland, the descendants of Viking settlers continued living on their isolated island. Life there remained difficult, shaped by cold winters, volcanic landscapes, and powerful storms. But Icelanders preserved something incredibly valuable: their stories. Scholars and writers began recording the old sagas that had once been passed down only through spoken storytelling. These texts described the adventures of early settlers, the voyages of explorers, and the struggles of families living in the harsh northern environment. Without these written sagas, much of what we know about the Viking Age might have been lost forever. Meanwhile, Greenland remained one of the most distant Viking settlements. Life there was challenging. Farmers struggled with short growing seasons and long freezing winters. Supplies from Iceland sometimes arrived late or not at all. For several centuries, the Greenland colonies survived through determination and careful use of the land. But gradually the climate grew colder during a period historians now call the Little Ice Age. Sea ice made travel more dangerous, and farming became harder. Over time, contact between Greenland and the rest of the Viking world slowly faded. Eventually the settlements disappeared completely, leaving behind only ruins of stone walls and abandoned farms. Today archaeologists study those remains to understand how the settlers lived in such a remote place. Back in mainland Scandinavia, the transformation from Viking society to medieval kingdom was complete by the late Middle Ages. Kings ruled organized states, churches stood in towns where once only wooden temples had existed. But the Viking heritage never truly vanished. Runestones carved with ancient symbols still stood beside old roads and fields. Some of these stones told stories about warriors who had traveled far from home. Others honored explorers who never returned from their voyages. Even the languages spoken across northern Europe carried traces of Old Norse words. Centuries later, historians and explorers would look back at the Viking Age with fascination. They realized that, Scandinavia, as the centuries passed, Viking raids became less common. European kingdoms had grown stronger and better defended. Castles protected important towns. Organized armies responded quickly to threats along the coasts. At the same time, Scandinavian societies themselves were becoming more stable. Farming communities expanded. Trade networks grew larger and more organized. Kings enforced laws across wider territories. The restless energy that once drove thousands of warriors onto longships began turning toward building kingdoms instead of raiding them. Historians often mark the end of the Viking Age around the year 1066. In that year, a Norwegian king named Harald Hardrada attempted one final large invasion of England. His army sailed across the North Sea and fought a fierce battle against English forces near a place called Stamford Bridge. At first the Viking warriors fought with incredible strength and courage, but the English army eventually overwhelmed them. Harald Hardrada was killed during the battle, and the Viking invasion collapsed. Only a few weeks later another army arrived from across the sea. This time it was not Vikings but Norman warriors from France led by William the Conqueror. Ironically, the Normans themselves were descendants of Vikings who had settled in France generations earlier. William defeated the English King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings and became the new ruler of England. With these events, the long era of Viking expansion finally came to an end. But the legacy of the Vikings did not disappear. Their ships had connected distant parts of the world long before most Europeans traveled far from home. Their settlements shaped the cultures of places like Iceland, Greenland, parts of Britain, Ireland, and Normandy. Their explorations reached North America centuries before later explorers crossed the Atlantic. Even today, traces of Viking language, culture, and stories remain woven into the history of many countries. The quiet fjords where the story began still exist, carved deep into the northern coastline. Pine forests still cover the mountains, and cold ocean winds still sweep across the water. Longships no longer leave those shores to explore unknown lands. But the memory of the people who once sailed them continues drifting through history, like the distant echo of oars moving across a calm northern. Subtle lesson. Raiders lost to storms, travelers guided by the stars, ships capsized yet salvaged. Every narrative highlighted the balance between ambition and caution, between action and reflection. The fjords reflected the growing light, water transforming from silvery gray to sparkling blue. Waves rippled gently, carrying tiny droplets that caught the sun and scattered them like diamonds. Longships prepared for departure began lowering sails, crews moving in synchronized rhythm. The sound of oars dipping into the water echoed across the fjord, punctuated by commands shouted in low, controlled tones. Each stroke was deliberate, each movement a blend of strength and coordination, echoing lessons of generations. The rise and fall, the ebb and flow, mirrored in human effort. In the forests, life continued its quiet patterns. Wolves emerged from dense sites, stretching and sniffing the air. Birds flitted from branch to branch, alert to the slightest movement. Trees, ancient and immense, held the memories of centuries in their rings, their bark scarred by lightning and the passage of time. Plants pushed through frost-hardened soil, persistent in their slow growth. Every element, the land, the animals, the wind, participated in a delicate equilibrium, teaching the villagers subtle lessons in observation, patience, and the inevitability of cycles. At the heart of the village, a gathering occurred. Not of warriors or rulers, but of those who kept knowledge alive, farmers, fishers, craftsmen, and elders. They shared strategies for the coming seasons, what to plant, where to fish, how to maintain tools, and how to observe the natural world for subtle signs of change. Decisions were informed by observation, tradition, and experimentation. Nothing was left to chance, each action aligned with rhythm and experience. The rise and fall of efforts matched to the cadence of seasons and tides. By mid-afternoon, the fjords were dotted with small boats. Fishermen worked in pairs, each movement synchronized with the other. Nets were cast, pulled, mended, and prepared for the next effort. The sound of water, the cries of gulls, and the creaking of wood combined into a layered soundtrack that was both functional and hypnotic. Even the act of fishing became a meditation, a practice of awareness, endurance, and timing. Those who watched from the cliffs above could see the balance of skill, patience, and intuition in every action. Deep in the forest, hunters moved with quiet precision. Their eyes scanned for signs, broken branches, footprints, scat, movement of prey in undergrowth. Each observation informed decisions, dictating approach, speed, and distance. Survival depended on rhythm, anticipation, and the understanding that every rise in movement might trigger a fall. A misstep or a misjudgment could mean failure. Yet, through observation and respect for patterns, success was achievable. The forest was alive with lessons, each rustle and scent carrying information for those who knew how to read it. Back in the village, evening approached. Smoke darkened, signaling fires for cooking and warmth. Children finished daily lessons, learning practical skills and listening to final stories of the day. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then more numerous, painting the sky with points of light. Conversations slowed, laughter softened, and the village settled into the rhythm of approaching night. Even as darkness fell, the story continued, of the land, the water, the people, the animals, all participating in a single continuous flow of existence. In the fjords, longships returned, oars cutting smoothly through calm water. The day's efforts brought sustenance and understanding. Crews communicated silently at times, relying on gestures and instinct developed over years. The rhythm of rowing, the glide of the hull, the reflection of the sky on the water, all created a subtle lesson. Raiders lost to storms, travelers guided by the stars, ships capsized yet salvaged. Every narrative highlighted the balance between ambition and caution, between action and reflection. The fjords reflected the growing light, water transforming from silvery gray to sparkling blue. Waves rippled gently, carrying tiny droplets that caught the sun and scattered them like diamonds. Longships prepared for departure began lowering sails, crews moving in synchronized rhythm. The sound of oars dipping into the water echoed across the fjord, punctuated by commands shouted in low, controlled tones. Each stroke was deliberate, each movement a blend of strength and coordination, echoing lessons of generations. The rise and fall, the ebb and flow, mirrored in human effort. In the forests, life continued its quiet patterns. Wolves emerged from dense sites, stretching and sniffing the air. Birds flitted from branch to branch, alert to the slightest movement. Trees, ancient and immense, held the memories of centuries in their rings, their bark scarred by lightning in the passage of time. Plants pushed through frost-hardened soil, persistent in their slow growth. Every element, the land, the animals, the wind, participated in a delicate equilibrium, teaching the villagers subtle lessons in observation, patience, and the inevitability of cycles. At the heart of the village, a gathering occurred. Not of warriors or rulers, but of those who kept knowledge alive, farmers, fishers, craftsmen, and elders. They shared strategies for the coming seasons, what to plant, where to fish, how to maintain tools, and how to observe the natural world for subtle signs of change. Decisions were informed by observation, tradition, and experimentation. Nothing was left to chance. Each action aligned with rhythm and experience, the rise and fall of efforts matched to the cadence of seasons and tides. By mid-afternoon, the fjords were dotted with small boats. Fishermen worked in pairs, each movement synchronized with the other. Nets were cast, pulled, mended, and prepared for the next effort. The sound of water, the cries of gulls, and the creaking of wood combined into a layered soundtrack that was both functional and hypnotic. Even the act of fishing became a meditation, a practice of awareness, endurance, and timing. Those who watched from the cliffs above could see the balance of skill, patience, and intuition in every action. Deep in the forest, hunters moved with quiet precision. Their eyes scanned for signs, broken branches, footprints, scat, movement of prey in undergrowth. Each observation informed decisions, dictating approach, speed, and distance. Survival depended on rhythm, anticipation, and the understanding that every rise in movement might trigger a fall, a misstep or a misjudgment could mean failure. Yet, through observation and respect for patterns, success was achievable. The forest was alive with lessons, each rustle and scent carrying information for those who knew how to read it. Back in the village, evening approached. Smoke darkened, signaling fires for cooking and warmth. Children finished daily lessons, learning practical skills and listening to final stories of the day. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then more numerous, painting the sky with points of light. Conversations slowed, laughter softened, and the village settled into the rhythm of approaching night. Even as darkness fell, the story continued, of the land, the water, the people, the animals, all participating in a single continuous flow of existence. In the fjords, longships returned, oars cutting smoothly through calm water. The day's efforts brought sustenance and understanding. Crews communicated silently at times, relying on gestures and instinct developed over years. The rhythm of rowing, the glide of the hull, the reflection of the sky on the water, all created a course while trying to reach Greenland. During the storm he had seen land to the west that did not match any known map. Bjarni never explored the land closely, but he remembered its forests and rolling hills. Leif listened carefully to the story. Greenland had very few trees, making wood extremely valuable. If a land filled with forests truly existed nearby, it could change life for the Greenland settlements. Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and gathered a small crew. Soon he set sail westward to search for the mysterious land. After several days at sea the crew spotted a rocky coastline. The land looked harsh and covered with flat stones. Leif named it Helluland, meaning the land of flat rocks. They continued sailing south until they reached another coast covered with thick forests. Leif called this place Markland, meaning forest land. The trees there would have been incredibly valuable to the Greenland settlers, but Leif decided to explore farther. Finally the crew reached a third land where the climate seemed milder. Rivers flowed through grassy fields, and wild grapes were said to grow there during certain seasons. Leif named this place Vinland. Modern historians believe Vinland may have been located somewhere along the coast of what is now Canada, possibly in Newfoundland. If this is correct, it means the Vikings reached North America nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. Leif and his crew spent time exploring the land. They built small shelters and gathered wood and other resources to bring back to Greenland. For a short time it seemed possible that Vinland might become another Viking settlement. But the distance between Greenland and Vinland was great. The journey across the cold ocean was difficult and dangerous. Conflicts with indigenous people living in the region also made permanent settlement challenging. Eventually the Viking attempts to colonize Vinland faded. Yet the achievement remained remarkable. The seafaring people from the cold fjords of Scandinavia had crossed the Atlantic Ocean and reached the shores of North America centuries before most of Europe even knew such lands existed. Back in Scandinavia and the lands they had settled across Europe, the Viking world continued evolving. Some warriors still traveled on raids, but many Vikings had become farmers, traders, and rulers in foreign lands. Their influence stretched from the icy Atlantic islands to the rivers of Russia and the cities of the Byzantine Empire. But as the centuries passed, powerful changes slowly began reshaping the Viking world. New kingdoms grew stronger across Europe, trade became more organized, and a new religion spread northward into Scandinavia, bringing ideas that would gradually transform the old Viking ways. The age of the Vikings had reached its village like sparks in dry grass. Curiosity grows, ambition grows, and eventually, someone asks a simple question. What if we sailed farther? No one knows exactly who led the first raid. History does not remember their names. But sometime around the year 793, Viking ships appeared off the coast of England. Their destination was a quiet island monastery called Lindisfarne. The monks living there had no idea what was coming. The longships arrived suddenly, dark shapes emerging from the morning mist. Their sails filled with cold wind from the north. Warriors leapt onto the shore. Fast, silent, terrifying. The raid was swift. Gold and silver were taken. Books were scattered across the floor. And the monks who survived fled in fear. For the people of Europe, this moment felt like the arrival of something unstoppable. The Vikings had come, and they would not disappear again for centuries. Back in Scandinavia, the news spreads quickly. The raid was successful. The ships returned full of treasure. And suddenly, many young men begin dreaming of distant shores. More ships are built. More expeditions are planned. Soon, Viking fleets begin appearing across the coasts of Europe. They strike monasteries, small towns, trading ports. But raiding is only one part of the Viking story. The Vikings are also explorers. Some sail west across the Atlantic. Others travel east through the rivers of Russia. They establish trade routes stretching thousands of miles. From the icy coasts of Greenland to the markets of Constantinople, Viking traders carry furs, ivory, weapons, and slaves. In return, they bring back silk, spices, silver coins, and stories of distant civilizations. Over time, Viking settlements appear across Europe. In England, Ireland, France, even parts of modern Russia. Some Vikings become kings, others become farmers in foreign lands. The Viking world grows larger with every generation. But expansion always comes with challenges. Rivalries form between powerful Viking leaders. Kingdoms fight for control, and the peaceful villages of Scandinavia slowly transform into a society shaped by power and ambition. Yet even as Viking influence spreads, the seeds of their decline begin quietly growing. Because the world around them is changing too. European kingdoms grow stronger, armies become more organized, cities build defenses against raiders. And slowly, the advantage once held by Viking longships begins to fade. But that future still lies far ahead. For now, the Viking age is just beginning. The seas are wide, the winds are strong, and the longships are ready. So as the fire in your longhouse crackles softly beside you, and the quiet village settles into another northern night, the story of the Vikings is only just beginning. And there is still a long journey. Its normal rhythm. Nets must still be repaired. Animals must still be cared for. Crops must still be tended during the short growing season. Yet something has changed. The longship carried more than sailors away from the fjord that morning. It carried the beginning of an era. Over the coming years more ships will follow similar paths. Each voyage will bring back new knowledge of distant coasts and unfamiliar lands. Sailors will speak of islands across the sea where forests grow thick and wild. They will tell stories of monasteries along foreign shores where treasures rest behind quiet stone walls. These stories will spread quickly through villages like yours. Curiosity will become ambition. Ambition will lead to exploration. Exploration will lead to raids, trade routes, settlements, and entire kingdoms influenced by the seafaring people of the north. Weeks pass after the longship's departure. Life continues quietly in the village, but the sea always holds the promise of returning travelers. One morning as the sun rises over the fjord, a distant shape appears on the horizon. At first it looks like a dark speck moving slowly across the water. As the hours pass it grows larger. Eventually the familiar curve of a longship becomes clear. The vessel glides back into the fjord carried by steady wind. When it reaches the shore the crew jumps into the shallow water and pulls the ship onto the sand. The sailors look tired but alive. Their clothing carries the salt of the sea and the dust of distant lands. Yet their eyes shine with excitement. They have stories to tell. Stories of wide coasts across the sea where monasteries stand filled with silver vessels and golden decorations. Stories of rivers that stretch deep into the lands of powerful kingdoms. Stories of cities larger than anything the people of the north have ever seen. These tales ignite something powerful within the village. Young men listen closely. Shipbuilders listen even more carefully. Soon plans begin forming for new journeys. Within a few years the quiet fjords of Scandinavia will no longer hold only fishing boats and small trading vessels. Longships will begin leaving these shores in greater numbers. Some will travel west toward the islands of Britain. Others will sail south along the coasts of Europe. Still others will venture east through the rivers of Russia. The Viking world will grow wider with every generation. And through it all the same rhythm will continue in villages like yours. Fires will burn inside longhouses. Children will grow beside the cold northern sea. Shipbuilders will shape wood into vessels capable of crossing oceans. The story that began beside this quiet fjord will slowly spread across half the known world. But for now the night settles once again over the village. The sea grows calm under the moonlight. The longship rests along the shore after its first successful voyage. The wind whispers softly through the pine forests above the fjord. And the long journey of the Vikings began its slow transition toward early morning. Shadows shifted with the faint hint of rising light. Birds stirred faintly in their nests. Wolves retreated to dens, their night hunt complete. The wind softened as it touched the fjord, carrying the quiet scent of salt, pine, and cold earth. Even the distant mountains seemed to exhale, releasing snow dust that drifted down like fine ash. Within the village, the blacksmith began stirring from sleep, awakening muscles stiff from rest. The rhythmic beat of his hammer resumed as he forged tools for the new day. Sparks flew, mixing with the first faint light of dawn, catching eyes and igniting wonder. The act was both practical and meditative, a reflection of life's rhythm, work, rest, observation, and repetition, all forming a cycle as old as the land itself. Hunters prepared silently for early tracking. They moved through the snow-covered forest with precision, boots pressing lightly, breath visible in the cold air. Every sound was measured, every movement considered. The forest itself seemed to respond. Branches creaked subtly, snow shifted under unseen weight, and distant deer paused, listening, feeling the rhythm of movement before returning to grazing. The hunters learned patience here, not through force, but through observation and understanding of subtle patterns. Fishermen set out again. Their longships cut through calm water with ease, oars moving in perfect synchronization. Nets were cast with experience, pulled with care, and the haul brought silently back to shore. The rhythm of rowing, the water's response, the wind's guidance, all contributed to a flow that was at once practical and hypnotic. The fjord became a classroom, a playground, and a meditation chamber simultaneously. As dawn became morning, children joined elders outside. Lessons resumed with stories of voyages and storms, of victories and mistakes. Every story emphasized awareness, patience, and adaptation. Some lessons were about animals, how wolves and foxes hunted, how birds sensed danger, how fish responded to tides. Others were human-centered, how to navigate, how to craft tools, how to understand subtle signs of nature. The rhythm was continuous. Story, observation, action, reflection, all blending seamlessly into life itself. By mid-morning, the village fully awoke. Fires burned steadily, smoke rising in gentle columns. People moved with purpose, coordinating tasks without spoken word at times. Children practiced skills alongside adults, throwing small spears, climbing small rocks, identifying plants, and reading subtle signs in water and wind. Each action reinforced lessons of patience, observation, and timing. Every step, every breath, was part of a larger cadence connecting generations, land, sea, and sky. The fjords shimmered under the morning sun. Waves lapped gently, longships rocked with minimal motion, birds wheeled gracefully. Even the distant mountains seemed alive, responding to sun and wind, their snow and rock reflecting the shifting light. Villagers continued their activities in harmony with these forces, synchronized with patterns that stretched back centuries. Observing the ebb and flow, they learned, adapted, and sailors crossed larger oceans. Travelers reached continents unknown to earlier generations. Eventually explorers would even leave the surface of the earth and travel into space. In many ways the Vikings were part of that same long human tradition of exploration. Their ships may seem small compared to modern vessels, but the journeys they made required enormous courage and determination. If you imagine once more standing beside the quiet fjord where this story first began, the scene feels almost timeless. The mountains rise silently around the water. Clouds drift slowly above the peaks. The sea moves gently against the rocky shore. Long ago a wooden ship once rested here, its sail ready to catch the wind. A crew climbed aboard without knowing exactly where their journey would lead. The horizon stretched before them, wide and mysterious. They pushed their ship into the water and sailed forward anyway. And with that simple act, the story of the Vikings began its long journey across. Museums across Scandinavia. Visitors can stand beside preserved longships and imagine what it must have felt like to sail across dark northern seas in such vessels. It is easy to picture the crew sitting along the benches with their oars ready. The wind fills the square sail while waves roll beneath the hull. Cold spray rises from the ocean as the ship pushes forward toward distant lands. Those sailors did not carry maps showing every coastline. They did not know exactly where their journeys would lead. Yet they sailed anyway. Curiosity pushed them forward. The promise of discovery kept them moving across open water. The Viking Age may have ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but the spirit that drove those explorers still lives in the human desire to travel farther and understand more about the world. From the quiet fjords of Scandinavia to the rivers of Eastern Europe and the distant shores of North America, the Vikings left behind a story of courage, ambition, and exploration. And if you imagine standing beside that same northern fjord where the first longship of our story once rested, the scene would still feel peaceful and familiar. The mountains rise quietly above the water. Pine trees sway gently in the cold wind. Waves move slowly across the surface of the sea. Long ago ships left this place and carried their crews toward unknown horizons. Tonight the fjord is calm again. But the memory of those voyages still drifts across the water like the fading echo of oars moving through the. Every story will inspire more ships, more voyages, more explorers, because once a people discover that the world is larger than they imagined, it becomes impossible to ignore the call of distant shores. The Viking Age grows slowly at first, like a fire that begins with a single spark. But with each passing decade, that fire spreads. New ships leave Scandinavian shores every year. Some travel west toward England and Ireland. Others move east into the rivers of Russia. They follow waterways that stretch thousands of miles through forests and plains. These Eastern Vikings will later be known as the Varangians. They trade with distant cities. They travel as far as Constantinople, one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. There, Viking warriors serve as elite guards for the Byzantine emperor. Tall northern warriors standing watch inside golden halls far from their icy homeland. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, villages continue their quiet rhythms. Children grow into adults, farmers harvest crops during short summers, and shipbuilders continue refining their craft. Each generation improves the longships. They become stronger, faster, more capable of surviving the rough northern seas. And with every improvement, the reach of the Vikings expands farther across the map. But history moves in cycles, and even the most powerful age eventually begins to fade. Centuries from now, the Viking Age will slowly come to an end. Kingdoms will grow stronger. Christianity will spread through Scandinavia. The Old Norse gods will slowly fade from daily life. But for now, those changes are still far in the future. Tonight, your village rests peacefully beside the dark waters of the fjord. The longship waits quietly under the moonlight. And somewhere beyond the horizon, countless unknown lands wait to be discovered. The journey of the Vikings has only just. Historians would later call the Viking Age. Over the next decades ships would cross the sea again and again. Some journeys would end in peaceful trade. Others would end in sudden raids along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. But the Vikings were not only raiders. They were explorers. They sailed rivers deep into Eastern Europe, carrying goods between distant markets. They traded furs, amber, iron tools, and finely crafted weapons. In return they brought home silver coins, silk, spices, and stories of lands far beyond the horizon. Back in the northern fjords life continued much as it always had. Children played along the rocky shoreline. Farmers worked their fields during the brief summers. Longhouses glowed warmly during the long dark winters. Yet the sea had changed everything. Where it once marked the edge of the known world, it now felt more like an open road leading outward in every direction. As years passed, the longships became larger and more advanced. Carved dragon heads appeared on the prows of some vessels, giving them a fierce appearance as they cut through the water. Crews grew more experienced. Navigation improved. Sailors learned to read the movement of waves, the patterns of seabirds, and the color of distant clouds to guide their journeys. The Vikings began establishing small camps along foreign shores. At first these camps lasted only a few weeks during the summer. Later some of them became permanent settlements. In Ireland, Viking traders built towns that eventually grew into important cities. One of these settlements would later become Dublin. In England, Viking leaders began claiming entire regions as their own territory. The land known as the Danelaw became a place where Scandinavian laws and customs shaped daily life. Yet even as their influence spread across Europe, the Vikings continued looking farther outward. Beyond the Western Sea lay vast stretches of unknown ocean, and somewhere beyond that ocean waited lands no European had ever seen. Another, fighting local rulers and capturing important towns. In Northumbria they seized the city of York, turning it into a major Viking stronghold. From there they expanded their influence across large areas of northern and eastern England. Many Anglo-Saxon leaders struggled to resist them. Some kingdoms paid tribute in silver simply to avoid destruction. Others attempted to fight but suffered defeat against experienced Viking warriors. Yet not every English kingdom surrendered easily. In the southern kingdom of Wessex, a young leader named Alfred began organizing resistance against the Viking advance. Alfred would later become known as Alfred the Great, but at this moment he was simply a determined ruler trying to defend his land. The struggle between Alfred's forces and the Viking armies would shape the future of England. Battles were fought across fields, forests, and fortified towns. Sometimes the Vikings gained ground. Other times Alfred managed to push them back. Eventually Alfred reorganized his defenses and built fortified settlements designed to protect the population from sudden attacks. These strongholds allowed his kingdom to survive during years of conflict. In time a fragile balance formed. Vikings controlled large areas of northern and eastern England, a region that became known as the Danelaw. Anglo-Saxon rulers maintained power in the south. For many years these two worlds existed side by side. Viking settlers began farming the land. Scandinavian laws and customs mixed with local traditions. Towns grew where traders from different cultures exchanged goods and ideas. The Vikings were no longer only raiders arriving suddenly from the sea. They had become settlers and rulers in foreign lands. Meanwhile exploration continued beyond Britain. Some Viking sailors traveled north and west across the cold Atlantic waters. These voyages required courage and patience. The ocean there could be rough and unpredictable. Storms rose quickly. Thick fog sometimes hid the horizon for days. But the Vikings had become masters of navigating the sea. They studied the stars, the movement of waves, and the behavior of seabirds to guide their journeys. During the late 9th century sailors discovered a large island far out in the Atlantic Ocean. The island contained volcanic mountains, steaming hot springs, and vast open valleys covered with grass. This place became known as Iceland. At first only a few explorers visited its shores. But word soon spread that Iceland offered something rare, land where settlers could build new communities far from the control of powerful kings. Families began sailing there in growing numbers. They brought animals, tools, and supplies for building farms. Small settlements appeared along the coasts and valleys. Life in Iceland was harsh but independent. Winters were long and cold. Storms battered the island, yet the settlers built farms and raised sheep and cattle. They created assemblies where disputes could be settled peacefully. One of these assemblies, the Althing, would become one of the oldest surviving parliaments in the world. As decades passed, Iceland grew into a thriving Viking society. But even Iceland did not mark the end of Viking exploration. Farther west across the ocean lay even more unknown waters. Most sailors believed nothing existed beyond them except endless sea. Yet a few adventurous explorers began wondering if land might still lie beyond the horizon. One of those explorers would soon change the map of the Viking world forever. His name was Eric the, integrating their stories into the broader tapestry of daily life. Night settled again. Fires glowed warmly, smoke curling skyward, mixing with the chill and scent of pine. Stars sparkled with quiet intensity, and the auroras danced faintly in the distance. Wolves stirred in the forest, owls watched silently, and the fjord whispered in response to every movement. Children drifted to sleep, their minds carrying fragments of stories, rhythms, and lessons, subtly absorbing awareness, patience, and timing. Elders moved quietly, checking fires, nets, and tools, their actions deliberate and rhythmic. The village itself seemed alive, breathing slowly in unison with the land, sea, and sky. Every night was both a rest and a lesson, a continuation of the cycle that connected generations. Even the faintest sound, a falling pine cone, a rustling animal, a distant wave, carried meaning for those who listened. In the high mountains, snow continued to drift, melting slowly in warmer patches, creating rivulets that joined streams below. Animals adjusted their routes, observing and responding to subtle environmental changes. Life in all forms followed rhythm, adaptation, and careful timing. The Vikings, immersed in this world, mirrored it, patient, observant, disciplined, yet flexible and respectful of nature's patterns. By the second night of this extended journey, the village was fully attuned to the land's rhythms. Fires burned low, nets dried, longships rested, and villagers rested yet remained subtly aware. Dreams reflected the day's lessons: navigation, observation, adaptation, patience, blending with the innate rhythm of life. The storyteller's voice lingered in memory, a gentle guide in the subconscious mind, reinforcing the slow, meditative pulse that defined the Viking way. As hours stretched, the auroras deepened, their movement hypnotic. The fjord mirrored them perfectly, creating a doubling effect that made it seem as if the sky flowed into the water. Small creatures moved quietly along the shore, fish shifted beneath the surface, and the occasional call of a gull punctuated silence. Every element reinforced attention, patience, and subtle awareness. The Vikings, their minds tuned to these patterns, found deep relaxation, almost meditation, in the flow of night. With each passing hour, the village's rhythm grew more pronounced. Daily tasks had settled into gentle cycles. Fires flickered and warmed without demanding attention. Longships rocked softly at the docks. Children's breathing slowed, adults moved calmly, elders observed quietly. The story of the Vikings, their voyages, lessons, and survival, merged seamlessly with natural rhythms: rise and fall, push and pull, observation and response. In the forest, predators and prey followed their eternal cycles. Wolves hunted carefully, foxes moved with stealth, birds navigated air currents with precision. Even the wind seemed to speak in a language of timing, brushing branches and rustling leaves to create patterns that were both guidance and warning. Villagers, immersed in these lessons, understood instinctively: awareness is not force but rhythm, patience is not in action but timing, survival is in observation and subtle adaptation. As dawn approached again, the village reached a state of quiet equilibrium. Fires burned low but steadily. Nets hung drying. Children slept peacefully. Adults prepared for the next day, not rushed, but with calm purpose. Longships awaited the tide. The fjord reflected subtle changes in light, guiding every step. Nature, stories, and human activity were perfectly synchronized, a living meditation. Even the distant mountains seemed to lean into this rhythm, shadows lengthening slowly, streams flowing in measured pace, snow reflecting faint light and melting imperceptibly. The auroras had faded, replaced by soft clouds that caught the first glow of sun. Villagers' determination was evident in every step. This was not a hurried journey but a measured one, each movement deliberate, each breath in rhythm with the cold air. He paused at the summit, looking out over the fjord below. Moonlight lit the water in a shimmering silver, and the auroras painted the sky in slow-moving waves. From this height, the world felt immense, and yet intimately connected. Every village, every forest, every longship was part of a larger story, a story of survival, curiosity, and the inexorable pull of adventure. As he descended, the wind changed slightly, bringing new scents. Smoke from another village, the freshness of snow on a distant ridge, and something deeper, more ancient, the lingering memory of battles fought, lands discovered, and lives built on courage and determination. The night seemed alive, not just with sound and scent, but with the echoes of thousands of choices made by countless generations. The Viking spirit was not confined to warriors or kings. It lived in fishermen, farmers, smiths, and children, in every action that respected the rhythm of the land and the cycles of the seasons. Back in the village, one family lit a small fire outside, not for warmth, but for observation. They watched as moths danced around the flame, as firelight flickered on the frost-covered grass. Stories continued, now interwoven with quiet reflection. The eldest recounted tales of navigation by the stars, how Vikings could cross seas in small ships, guided by the sun and the patterns of waves. Children learned not just the mechanics of survival, but the philosophy of it, the patience, the courage, the respect for forces larger than themselves. Night deepened further, and the auroras shifted in slow, mesmerizing waves. Wolves' howls echoed faintly across valleys, answering each other in distant calls. Owls glided silently between trees, occasionally pausing to observe movement below. The water in the fjords shimmered as if breathing, the rhythm of the tides marking the invisible heartbeat of the land. Even the wind seemed to carry stories, moving from forest to village, from mountain to sea, blending past and present in a continuous, living narrative. The longships, silent now, remained sentinel-like, watching over the coast. Their wood, though weathered, held the memory of countless journeys. One could almost hear the oars dipping into water long ago, the shouts of warriors, and the steady drumbeat of rowing in unison. Even abandoned, these vessels seemed to participate in the story, reminders that life is made not just of moments, but of the movements that connect them, the rise and fall, the ebb and flow, the pursuit of knowledge and adventure. Within the village, quiet reflection continued. Families spoke softly, their words mixing with the ambient sounds of the night. Children, now drowsy, listened to final stories before sleep. The lessons were practical and philosophical: how to live with courage, how to observe nature, how to carry the memory of ancestors without being trapped by it. Sleep itself was a continuation of the rhythm, a surrender to cycles larger than oneself, an immersion into the stories whispered by wind, water, and earth. The auroras reached their peak, weaving the sky with colors that seemed impossible in daylight. Stars glimmered like distant fires, each one a story, a journey, a life. The fjords reflected this celestial dance, mirroring the sky in the water's dark surface. Night, though quiet, was not empty. It was full of observation, of movement, of the pulse of life, human and non-human intertwined. Every breath, every ripple, every shift of shadow was a note in the symphony of survival and reflection that had been composed over generations. In the hills beyond the village, the solitary figure finally rested. Sitting on a rock, he observed the night in silence. Wolves moved in the distance. These northern sailors had accomplished something extraordinary. Using wooden ships and simple navigation methods, they had connected distant regions of the world long before modern technology existed. They had sailed rivers across Eastern Europe, reaching markets connected to Asia and the Middle East. They had crossed the stormy North Atlantic to settle islands like Iceland and Greenland. And they had reached the shores of North America hundreds of years before later European explorers. The Viking Age was not only about battles and raids. It was also a story about exploration, curiosity, and the courage to travel beyond the edge of the known world. If you return once more in your imagination to the quiet fjord where this story began, the scene remains peaceful. Cold water reflects the pale northern sky. Pine forests cover the mountains that rise along the coast. The wind moves softly across the surface of the sea. 1,000 years ago longships once rested along this shoreline. Crews prepared their sails while families watched from the beach. Those ships carried explorers, traders, and dreamers toward distant horizons. Tonight the fjord is silent. But somewhere in the deep memory of history, the sound of oars still moves across the water, steady and calm, guiding the longships of the past into the endless, hypnotic, almost meditative state. Observers on shore felt it too, the rise and fall, the ebb and flow, echoing the cycles of life, of effort, and of rest. The night deepened further, and the auroras once again painted the sky with undulating colors. Wolves howled faintly, distant but resonant, a call answered by the rhythm of the forest. Fires flickered, casting shadows on snow and stone. The village slept in waves, some in deep sleep, others restless, yet all part of a shared rhythm that spanned generations. Even the wind seemed to move in gentle pulses, a constant reminder that life, effort, and observation were intertwined in a dance that never truly. Their eyes catching the light, their presence a reminder of the balance of life. The wind carried the sound of water, the distant laughter of children in the village, the soft crackle of fires. The night was alive, a living story, and he was part of it, not merely an observer. In this moment, the past and present converged, the lessons of ancestors, the rhythms of nature, the quiet knowledge that life was a continuous rise and fall, a series of choices and reflections, like the tides in the morning light settled gently across the fjord, painting the water in soft hues of rose, gold, and silver. Longships glided with minimal effort, sails catching the first whispers of wind. Every movement was deliberate, attuned to natural rhythms. Oars dipped quietly into the calm surface, creating ripples that expanded outward in perfect circles, reflecting clouds, gulls, and the distant peaks. Villagers moved slowly through the early day, carrying small baskets, adjusting nets, and tending fires. Each action was measured, following the cadence learned from countless seasons of observation. Children wandered barefoot along the shores, listening to water trickle over pebbles, feeling the smooth stones beneath their feet. Their steps were quiet, their breathing slow, each moment a lesson in patience and awareness. Elders watched from the edges of the village, their eyes soft but observant. They noted patterns in waves, bird movements, and wind shifts. Every detail offered guidance, sometimes practical, sometimes symbolic. These lessons were passed on subtly, through gestures, pauses, and quiet words, allowing younger villagers to absorb without effort. It was a rhythm of learning, of continuity, and of mindful living. The storyteller gathered a small group near the hearth, continuing tales of distant lands, strange seas, and courageous Vikings who faced unknown dangers. The voice rose and fell like the tide, slow, steady, and hypnotic. Listeners leaned in unconsciously, their hearts slowing, minds absorbing the cadence. The story described treacherous waves, towering cliffs, and longships battling storms, but always in a controlled, rhythmic pace that soothed rather than alarmed. Every word was deliberate, a slow dance of sound and imagery designed to lull the mind into calm awareness. In the forest, sunlight filtered through branches, creating dappled patterns on the ground. Birds flitted between trees, insects moved deliberately, and small animals followed hidden trails. The villagers observed quietly, learning the subtle languages of their environment. Each sound, motion, and shift carried meaning. A snapped twig could indicate passage of a deer or fox. A distant bird's call might signal wind changes. Awareness was a living practice, as much about observation as patience, repetition, and quiet attention. By midday, the longships were prepared for another short voyage along the fjord. Sailors moved in harmony, adjusting ropes, testing sails, and checking oars. Each movement mirrored the natural flow of wind and water. The fjord responded with gentle waves, reflecting light in shifting patterns that guided timing and pace. Birds and fish followed similar rhythms, moving in synchrony with currents, echoing the larger cycles of nature. The Vikings, immersed in this flow, experienced an almost meditative state, every stroke, every adjustment, every observation part of a slow, soothing rhythm. Back in the village, artisans worked quietly. Blacksmiths, hammers fell in steady cadence, woodworkers shaped planks with rhythmic precision, and weavers produced fabric with deliberate, patterned movements. Each craft was a lesson in flow, repetition, and attention, reinforcing subtle meditation through rhythm. Even minor errors were corrected with calm patience, teaching resilience, focus, and the gentle balance of effort and observation. As the afternoon unfolded, villagers gathered near the fjord to prepare communal meals. Firewood was arranged, water fetched, and ingredients handled with care. The sounds of chopping, stirring, and boiling blended into a gentle symphony. Children and adults alike absorbed the flow, learning that even mundane tasks could become meditative when performed mindfully. Breathing slowed, hearts aligned with subtle rhythms, and a sense of calm pervaded every action.